The Switch 2 Event Horizon is here. Finally, a new Nintendo console. It's been a little over 8 years now since the Switch 1 launched, making it the longest stretch of time between any two Nintendo game consoles. This is a huge deal if you're a fan of gaming or the Nintendo Switch was your first console because it's such a household name. But everywhere you look online, there's so much controversy. I wanted to go over all the discourse leading up to this pivotal moment in Nintendo's history, give my own thoughts and opinions, and play a little devil's advocate. The first source of discourse was that the Nintendo Switch 2 is not innovative enough. Nintendo being known for their innovation where every console has a gimmick, like the DS's touchscreen, 3DS with the 3D, the Wiimote, the Wii U gamepad. But the Switch 2 just does the same thing as the Switch, but with more features. What really doesn't help is that the box is basically the same as the Switch, but with a 2 on it. The inside of the packaging is pretty boring from what we've seen from people that got their hands on the Switch 2 early. And the UI is more or less the same, with slight differences. This definitely gives the impression that Nintendo is playing it safe. The Switch is one of the most successful consoles they ever made. Just do it again, but 2. There's deceptively a lot going on here. Mainly, it's basically ground up new hardware. Without going into all the nerdy stuff, it does take development time to bring up entirely new hardware. And now it's a 6.5 by 10.7 inch display, making the screen bigger than the OLED and the original Switch. With a bigger screen means more room for resolution. It's now 1080p in handheld as opposed to the 720p of the original. It can even hit 120 Hz with its variable refresh rate. It comes out the box of 256 gigs of flash storage with a custom Tegra T239 CPU. Analysts say that this puts the console on par with the PS4 and the Xbox One. So luckily, thanks to upscaling with the NVIDIA processor, when docked, the video could be up to 4K 60 FPS, making it the first 4K Nintendo console, meaning finally actually 4K Mario. While being a great technical jump for Nintendo, this is obviously not the most cutting edge, but a respectable little handheld gaming device nonetheless. The feature I'm most excited for is mouse controls, where you can make the Joy-Con into a mouse, and some developers have even shown that you can plug in a mouse and use that. The big main feature that Nintendo is showing off is the microphone. It has a built-in microphone for the online chat. We're talking about the actual console features. Switch Online was a big proponent of the Switch 2 reveal. It is seen as a core feature of the console that's expanded on from the Nintendo Switch, right? There's voice chat and camera UI things. They're so big on this feature that until March 2026, game chat will be free for Switch 2 users. And after that, you will need to pay for it, likely with your Nintendo Switch Online subscription. And those are the biggest changes. So you can see why on face value, yeah, it doesn't seem that impressive. They're pushing voice chat. Okay, just use Discord. It's not the top of the line specs. There's no new gimmicks other than mouse controls. So while I think that this is a valid criticism, I think that this was the obvious move to do. Maybe a lot of the hype of a new Nintendo Switch console was taken away since we've been hearing about the Switch Pro, a 4K Switch Pro for years now, and then it ended up just being the Switch 2. But nonetheless, this has sparked many a debate. I've seen many articles with doom and gloom saying the Switch 2 is primed to fail because it does nothing new and it's too expensive, which we'll talk about later. Articles saying the game industry bubble's bursting, so Nintendo's doomed, which is an argument for why Nintendo is playing it safe. And I don't know about you guys, but some people were not even able to pre-order the Switch 2 because there was such a demand for it. And at the end of last year, some industry analysts were saying that Nintendo's next console, coupled with GTA 6 release before the delay happened, would be so dominant in gaming that Xbox might not survive the next console generation in terms of selling hardware. That's obviously a topic for a whole nother video, but I am in the camp to lean that the Switch 2 will be extremely successful. If it can hit the same numbers as the Switch, time will tell. It's obviously a completely different gaming landscape now, where there are now many different handheld consoles, the Steam Deck, the ROG Ally, to name some. Even PlayStation dipping their toe into the handheld market again with the PlayStation Portal. I know that's not a true handheld, but there are rumors that PlayStation will release a dedicated handheld console, think like the PlayStation Portable. And people have been talking about an Xbox handheld for years that can play Steam. I think that these rumors have legs to stand on, and it's not the same market. The Nintendo Switch was completely dominating the space, and now it has to compete in the handheld gaming market. What sold the Switch for me, even though they are playing it safe, are these exclusives. Not only with video quality, but you can see the technical leap here. Like the environmental destruction and interaction of Donkey Kong Bonanza, or the increased player count or environment, or just overall fidelity of Mario Kart World. 100% for me, the games is selling the system, although I am a console player myself and tend not to play that much on PC. But when I see what the Switch 2 can do in terms of these games, and we'll see native 1080p and upscaled 4K, this does feel like a true console generation to me. So to sum up this segment, people have a point that there's no pomp and circumstance with the Switch 2 branding or innovation, especially when the marketing just mainly shows off game chat and hey, it's a Switch, it's a better Switch. And with how many consoles Nintendo is manufacturing, as well as the infrastructure retailers had to put in place to just support the Switch 2 launch because of the demand, I think the Switch 2 will be a powerhouse. Complete space domination. We'll see about that. Speaking of sales, Nintendo has a forecast that they will sell 15 million Switch 2 units between now and March 2026, making it the fastest selling console of all time. But analysts project that the Switch 2 will sell faster than that even. But President Furukawa explains why they have this conservative sale estimate, because the president of Nintendo acknowledges that the price is pretty steep for a Switch 2. And that was the other huge discourse leading to the console's release, the price. I, for one, felt extreme sticker shock, especially being Canadian. It was like $700 for the Switch 2 bundled with Mario Kart. I would have just gotten the base console. However, Mario Kart World is an $80 game, and I saved $45 by buying the bundle instead of Mario Kart World on its own. $45 is half the price of the game itself. The Switch 2 launches at $450, which feels like a steep jump from the original Switch, which had an MSRP of $300. On top of that, the flagship game Mario Kart World was $80, as we said, which feels like things are rising way too fast, too quickly, as Tears of the Kingdom was the first $70 Switch game, and now just 2 years later, we have our first $80 Switch game. Then shortly after, Switch 2 pre-orders were canceled because of the geopolitical state of the world right now, prompting even further backlash and fears that the Switch 2 price will increase. Hindsight's 2020, it didn't. However, peripherals like the camera, the carry case, and even the new Zelda and Street Fighter 6 amiibo went up in price once the pre-order was available once again, which $40 for the Street Fighter amiibo does feel like, oh man, it definitely does give you sticker shock. This price increase could not have come at a worse time, as we were seeing other gaming consoles steadily increase in price in the worldwide markets, like the PS5. The PS5 Pro got a lot of backlash for its sticker cost, and after the Switch 2 was announced, Xbox themselves raising the price of their consoles. It's just the market feels terrible right now. All the prices are increasing. This made a perfect storm for backlash for what feels like a sharp price increase from the price of a Switch and the $20 price increase in games over the last 2 years. There was immense backlash in any of the live streams Nintendo hosted of Treehouse Live showing gameplay, where the entire chat was flooded with drop the price. Okay, now for the facts. There are currently 2 Switch games that are $79.99, that being Mario Kart World and Tears of the Kingdom Nintendo Switch 2, which is arguably just the Nintendo Switch Tears of the Kingdom, $70, plus the Switch 2 upgrade, which is $9.99. The other major new Switch 2 first-party game, being Donkey Kong Bonanza, is $69.99. And of course, this is going to be a heated discussion as there is no end to sight. Just earlier in May, President of Nintendo, Mr. Furukawa, emphasizes how important the launch of the Switch 2 is, but if the whole tariff things changes, prices may change accordingly, which also arguably means that maybe the prices will go down if the global trade situation calms down a bit. However, Furukawa did say in an interview that hardware production and the US trade situation was not a factor when creating the sales projection at Nintendo for the Switch 2. But feels like a bit of a contradictory statement though, since he then says the financial projections were created based on on the assumption the US tariffs would be 10% on products produced in Japan, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and 145% in China. Their hardware is produced in China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and for North America, that hardware is mainly produced in Vietnam. And the amiibos are produced in China, which confirms why the $10 price increase for the new prints. He says, as a basic policy, any country or region, if tariffs are imposed, we recognize them as part of the cost and incorporate them into the price, which is why we see that region-locked Nintendo Switch 2s in Japan are a fair bit cheaper than the prices seen in the rest of the world. That being said, that did not convince many people that Nintendo is just being greedy and screw it, you'll pay for it anyways. I definitely had that thought myself for some of the products, but we'll get into if Nintendo's being greedy in a moment. To wrap up my thoughts on what Furukawa was saying, it seems like this is the most important year for the Nintendo Switch 2. They're basically saying that it's make or break for the momentum, and that's probably why they're being so aggressive when it comes to controlling what is seen pre-launched and people tampering with the consoles, which we'll get into later. From my personal experience, when I was waiting in line at GameStop to pre-order the Switch 2, I was talking to the people in line around me, and one man said that he is pre-ordering the Switch 2 purely because he thinks the price will go up because of the global trade situation. Now, is Nintendo being greedy with these prices? Furukawa said in a financial results briefing that with the launch of the Switch 2, we expect the gross profit ratio to decline due to Nintendo Switch 2 hardware having a lower profit margin than Nintendo Switch hardware. And that's despite them projecting that they will sell more Nintendo Switch 2s in the first year than the Switch. So profit margin means that Nintendo makes less money per console sold than they did on the Switch. This could be the reason for a price increase in the software, because hardware is known to be a borderline loss leader for publishers, where it's the cost of entry, you get the console, you get the Xbox, you get the PlayStation, the Nintendo, and they don't really make money on the sale of the hardware, but they make their real money with the software sales, the game sales. And maybe that would explain my gut reaction, where I didn't think the console was overpriced. Yes, it was pricey, but I was like, shaking my head, all right, that's fair. But the games felt too overpriced. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I am not willing to spend $80 for Mario Kart. That's why I got the bundle. However, I'm not an extreme Mario Kart fan. There's definitely other games I'm willing to spend $80 on, so I can definitely see why others would be. President of Nintendo of America, Doug Bowser, said in an interview that it's not true that tariffs were already priced into the high $450 MSRP price tag of the Switch 2, but that they're actively assessing the situation and it creates challenges and it's something we're going to have to address. So which is it? This statement from Nintendo of America's president is another argument that the price of games is just increasing to compensate for the cost of this. Nintendo of America's vice president, Bill Trinan, when asked about the controversial $80 Mario Kart World, said it's less about the pricing strategy. It's more just whenever we look at a given game, we just look at what is the experience and what's the value. Honestly, this is a game that is so big and so vast. As people end up buying and playing the game, they're going to find this to be probably the richest Mario Kart experience they've ever had. This statement obviously got a lot of backlash. No one likes to be told, trust me, it's worth it, when it comes to justifying spending more money than what you expected. So going through the factors, we can see that this whole debate is a little more nuanced. Unfortunately, my personal opinion is that it's somewhere in the middle of both things, being that, well, they're a business, they need to make money, especially with how difficult and bad the gaming industry has been lately. And damn, that's expensive, which obviously means I'm going to anger a lot of people because I'm playing devil's advocate for both sides. This is a very dangerous game though for Nintendo if the price keeps increasing without a good justification other than this is a big game. It's a dangerous place to be in to lose consumer trust. With the price increases and not a clear statement of if tariffs are actually a factor here, especially since the console is cheaper in Japan, it has led to a decrease in consumer trust. Ain't no way. So of course, while editing this video, more news dropped. Honestly, a good example of what the media looks like right now. So I'm adding this here because we're talking about the Japanese market. Bloomberg released an article saying that Nintendo actually struck a deal with Switch 2 distributors where the realtor would make 5% margin on the sale of a Switch 2 console versus the typical 2% on other gaming consoles. This follows the narrative of the aggressive first year that Furukawa has for hardware and that Nintendo doesn't really make money on hardware. And also along with criticism that, oh, Nintendo is greedy, they're also trying to strong arm the Japanese game market that they're already extremely dominant in by incentivizing distributors to focus on Switch 2 sales. Not even hours after that article was published by Bloomberg, Nintendo made an official response saying, a news report related to the wholesale price of the Nintendo Switch 2 in the Japanese market was published. We want to clarify that this report is not true. Nintendo does not disclose any information regarding business conditions with distribution and retail partners. So Nintendo can put a stake in the ground and say, that ain't true. I'm very surprised at the speed in which they responded. Maybe the straightforward communication will build more trust with consumers. Unlike how people felt over the whole digital library situation with the Switch 2, which is our next topic of discourse with the Switch 2. Nintendo's big push for an all-digital library, with the whole game key mechanic and locking down game sharing, with it being an actual feature to track the ownership of a digital game. Game keys are where the cartridge doesn't actually have the ROM of the game, but is simply a code to authenticate a download where you need that key to play your downloaded digital game. It's hard to miss as there's a big ugly text on the box saying it's just a game key. Game keys are nothing new. We've definitely seen physical releases where it's just a code in a box. This is Nintendo's way of giving a cute little name to it. Why is it such a problem if games have already been doing this for years now? Well, most of all third-party games on the Switch 2 are a game key, and a ROM or the actual game being on the cartridge is the exception. Cyberpunk 2077 and its DLC is all on the 64 gig cartridge. Other than that, it's just Marvelous USA's games that are coming to Switch 2 that are not a game key, being Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar, Rune Factory, Guardians of Azuma, and Daemon X Machina Titanic Cyan. But the Japanese version of the game is a game key, so it's only Marvelous USA, where CEO Ken Berry said the decision to make it a ROM was made many months ago, and it was not an easy decision to make, but they thought their fans would much prefer the ROM option, and well, they were right. Night Drive Studios CEO Stephen Kick summed up why this whole game key thing left a bad taste in people's mouth. Like tasting a Nintendo Switch cartridge, I guess. Stephen says that seeing Nintendo do this is a little disheartening. You would hope a company that big that has such a storied history would take preservation a little more seriously. There's a fear that moving everything digitally will impact game preservation. And with an all-digital library, the only way to share games instead of passing over cartridges would be through the game sharing feature on the Switch 2 that Nintendo calls virtual game card sharing, where you can loan out your virtual game to another person or another Switch, and when the lending time frame expires, it will be returned to your library. Where the controversy comes in was prior to this update, two separate Switches owned by the Nintendo account could play that single game at the same time. But now with the virtual game card system, if one Switch is online and playing that game, you can no longer boot up that game on the other Switch under the Nintendo account. So while the virtual game card system seems nice on paper that you could share between people, players are seeing this as a way to lock down the ownership of a game. And having the game physically being on the cartridge being the exception for the Switch 2, especially when it comes to third-party games, has people worried that Nintendo is going to go all digital. This was most obviously a weird push, or that there's something in the way with the Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD remake, where the Switch 1 and the PS5 version had the game on the disc or the ROM, but the Switch 2 version is a game key card. An unlikely source gave us a little more insight as to why all these third-party developers are going with game key cards for the Switch 2. Arc System Works developers of Dragon Ball FighterZ and Guilty Gear suffered from a massive hack that led to a massive data leak this year. The leak saw that Nintendo gave these third-party publishers and developers three options: digital game only, a game key card, or a card with the full game, but the only option is a 64 gigabyte block for the ROM. That's contrary to Switch 1 cartridges, where developers and publishers had the options of 8 gig and 16 gigs writing a ROM on the cartridge. But this leak with ArcSys seems to confirm that their only option for the ROM is on 64 gig. This means that the developer and publishers have to pay for a full 64 gigabyte cartridge for every single one of their physical releases, which you can imagine is expensive, especially for a game like Rune Factory. Makes more sense for a game like Cyberpunk 2077 and its Phantom Liberty DLC being on one 64 gig cart. Mario Kart World is about 23.5 gigs. So do you think they could have used the 32 gig Switch 2 cartridge for it? Or did they go with the full 64? Or does does the conspiracy go deeper where they only offer this 64 gig cart to third-party developers so that they're incentivized to go digital only or game key card only? It's clear that a lot of people still prefer physical games, and with every mention of a new game that comes to Switch 2, you'll see there's a blurb if it's a game key or not, and you'll see all the comments say, I'm gonna skip on this one, it's a game key, my Switch 2 library is gonna be small because it's a game key. I think it's fair. I go physical on all my games, and if it's a third-party game, I honestly prefer to get it on my PS5 because I don't really use my Switch in handheld mode. I could 100% see why this would be annoying for people if they do like to get their whole library on the Switch, and it's just a key card. Like, why am I lugging around this card if I have to use all my Switch memory anyways, and buy a compatible SD card because all my games are basically digital, but I have something to put on my shelf? Again, going back to me waiting in line for the Switch 2 pre-order, I did ask around if it bothered them, the game key card, and everyone I was talking to unanimously said, yeah, I hate it. They like to share their games, or it just feels like a cheap push to be one step away from being digital only libraries. Basically, people want the freedom of choice, but all around it is becoming harder to get games physically, like getting a disc drive attachment for your PS5, or all the early access incentives for pre-ordering a game digitally. I fully admit I am an old head gamer for getting most of my games physical on a console, but with digital only access, there's always the fear of some server not providing the game anymore, or access being revoked. You're just buying a license, you don't own it, which goes to the final and most recent source of all the discourse or controversy around the Switch 2 prior to launch, and that is the security on the Switch 2. So some people have gotten their hands on the Switch 2 early, and so far it seems that you cannot play Nintendo Switch games on the Switch 2 right out the box without connecting to the internet and getting an update. So the fear is that you have to connect to the server and be online to even play your Switch 2 out of the box, and if Nintendo catches a whiff that your console has been tampered with or modded, they will brick your console and you cannot even play with your Nintendo account unless you agree to those services. So far, when it comes to the day one update thing, we don't know the extent of if it will be all day one Switch 2s that have this for this exact reason of people getting it early and showing everything. Basically, every game on the Nintendo Switch library got leaked a week prior to it being out and played on an emulator. So maybe this is Nintendo's way of locking it down. They seem to really be trying to have a handle on things related to the Switch 2 and the marketing, like releasing the Nintendo Today app, where it's a source of Nintendo news, and trying to block the ability to actually screen record, whereas most apps you would just share posts from the app. But it seems like they really want to control and curate the news that gets to people about the Switch 2, and by extension not let people that happen to get their hands on the Switch 2 early show the games on the console. I mean, even leading up to the Switch 2, we had so many leaks with the Switch Pro, and then all the leaks from the peripheral vendors leaking what the Switch 2 was way before it was even announced. Following Nintendo news is hilarious because you either hear about something months in advance that's leaked, or they shadow drop something and catch you completely off surprise that no one saw coming. Either way, people made a big deal about this. I can understand why it's annoying to have to take something out of the box and connect to the internet to even use it. Again, we'll see about the extent of that and if it's just the day one Switches, and to what level are you able to even do things with the Switch 2 without connecting online, like Switch 2 games, or sorry, Switch 1 games was the thing that was blocked. If you can play any of those without connecting online, and I get it. You got a TV today and needs to connect to the internet before you can use it. You got a light bulb and you need an app before you can use it. It is annoying. And again, it could be seen that Nintendo just wants to keep tabs on the hardware out there to try to police any, modifications. I will say, unfortunately, it is now an industry standard in tech to secure the software and the hardware that can even boot up on a system. You may own your console, but legally the hardware key that is used to say this is an authentic out-of-the-box Switch 2 operating system and hardware, that key is proprietary. If you bypass that key, yes, they are within their legal right to brick your system. That's literally, unfortunately, what Microsoft does as well. Standard Windows 11 compatibility means that you have a piece of hardware that can generate that key to securely boot up Windows 11. It is an industry standard now that if that trusted boot up sequence is bypassed, either it goes back to the factory load or it's a brick. And I saw this tweet. Lonely Goomba says, I'm not being a Nintendo apologist, but needing an internet connection to set up the Switch 2 is such a non-issue. The fact is, if you don't have access to the internet, you're not playing like 90% of modern games anyways at this point. It's just how it's been for decades. decade. And someone responded that I wanted to, because seems to be a common comment about why this is a bad thing. What if it's 2050, the Switch 2 is factory reset, and the console cannot connect to modern Wi-Fi? What if the day one update isn't hosted on the servers anymore? This is designed obsolescence and an attempt to remove your ownership, dude. I'm just legally speaking here. The vendor or the manufacturer owns that secure boot up process. The other thing is that's not how a factory reset works. It doesn't roll back to the day one operating system of the software. It just wipes any user data and is essentially a clean slate of the current operating system on it, the current version. The best way I can explain it again is with a Windows example. If you go from Windows 10 to Windows 11 and you do a factory reset, it doesn't go back to Windows 10. It's a clean slate of that Windows 11 build of your operating system. Okay, so that's point number one. So let's say you have a day one Switch, again, assuming that it's only the launch Switches that have this security feature that require an internet setup to play Switch 1 games. You have a day one Switch in 2050. It wouldn't just be the day one upgrade that needs to be available on a server, but any upgrade. Not only is this end of life with new security and development for the Switch 2, but the eShop is down and there is no more upgrades. It's completely deleted. Then yeah, in such a scenario, your day one Switch 2 will not be usable, assuming that you cannot play Switch 1 games on it without an internet day one update. Horrible take. If I went to a place with no electricity and dodgy cellular data, I'm not about to drain my phone faster sharing data to my Switch just to play Gunvolt if it even connects. In what world? Oh, okay, my sealed out of factory Switch 2 that I brought to the Sahara. All right, I'm trying to show both sides of the argument. The things people are ripping on Nintendo for are now industry standards, unfortunately. Does that mean I think it's great? No. Let me make my own bullcrap random scenario. Imagine a world where we all have super smart cars and somehow they see your car is tampered with. Does that give them the right to just brick your car in the middle of the road? The way the world is heading, legally, I guess so. So this all hit its pinnacle recently when people that have gotten their hands on their Switch 2, what did they try to do? They've already took to modding it. Unsuccessfully, I might add. So when using your Nintendo account, you gotta agree that Nintendo could essentially brick your Switch if they see that it's modified. Well, good luck even getting there, because multiple avenues of attempting to hack a Switch has led to it being bricked as well. They tried an empty MIG cart, which is essentially for ROM dumping, and the Switch 2 bricked and ended up in a boot loop. They prod the flash drive of the ROM chip and the Switch 2 brick, indicating that it's able to detect voltage change if something's probing it. Apparently also getting it to reboot, getting it to run unsecure code doesn't work on the Switch 2 anymore. And the only way to re-flash the firmware is to get it off of Nintendo's official server, meaning you cannot have a local backup of the firmware from an SD card. It doesn't work, which again is controversial, not just because if you want to mod it, what if your system genuinely needs some tinkering? And it is 20 years and we have some game preservation attempts with retro consoles. Switch 2 will be retro, and the only way to flash new firmware is off of an official Nintendo server. And if you probe the device and if you try to dump a ROM for preservation, it bricks the Switch 2. There is no confirm yet on how this is actually going to play out for regular consumers. Again, the system isn't even out yet. Take this with an extreme grain of salt though. This is being touted around as fact. We really won't know until the console is released. But every single one of the controversies we have gone over have a similar theme to it. Nintendo wants to control your console and you don't have any ownership and you're just going to shut up and pay them anyways. And I can see why. It goes back to consumer trust. Nintendo has not been great with game preservation ever since they got rid of the virtual console and instead went to a subscription service with the Switch online rollout of old games as ROMs and the ever increasing rising cost of retro games. I get it. Couple that with the fact that all Switch emulators got nuked with legal action from Nintendo. And if I stick a pin weird in my console or try to dump a game I bought, my entire system gets bricked. My final thoughts are, it's still exciting that there's a Switch 2 coming out. A lot of the discourse with the security stuff bricking the console if you try to dump a ROM, and the day one online access is all speculation. It has no source for the whole modding tinkering thing. I do hope that Nintendo does give devs and publishers more options with the ROM storage though. It looks like it's an intentional hassle for third-party developers to decide to put the ROM on the cartridge, as we've seen with Cyberpunk 2077. 2077, and Marvelous USA, where it was an effort to do this instead of using the game key card or a digital only release. With a new Nintendo console coming out this week and a new entry in the Mario Kart series that's not a mobile game coming out for the first time in 2 console generations, it is exciting times. Don't let all the controversy ruin the hype. I did want to examine the controversy because I think that some of it is valid and some of it is definitely blown out of proportion for like, oh, what if this happens and I'm screwed? What if that happens and I'm screwed? There's definitely justification and worry in certain things. Like if $80 games become the new norm, it looks like we're far from that currently though. The console price is going to increase like the other home systems. And if it wasn't for the backwards compatibility, the whole system would be digital only library. Like with most discourse on the internet, it is not a complete black and white situation. But because I tried to expand on both sides, I imagine that this video will get a lot of hate. If you made it this far, well, thank you for watching. Please leave a like, dislike, comment what you think. If you want to see more examples of how risky it is for developers and publishers these days, check out this video about EA canceling the new Black Panther game. Have a good one. Thank you so much for watching and listening to me ramble. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.